Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Mirabelle. I'm chairman of the Research Support and Prevention Committee. And on behalf of myself and my colleagues at Tour de Cure and the entire Tour de Cure family, I'd like to welcome you to this, our first live webinar series. I'm sitting here with my iron shirt and my board shorts, so like the rest of Australia, I'm properly equipped for this series. I won't ask our guests to demonstrate what they're wearing beneath their waist, but we welcome everyone to what is a very unusual time, but one where, quite frankly, we want to stay in touch with the researchers that we support. At Tour de Cure, our aim has always been to cure cancer. This year, we are feeling the effects of COVID-19 like everyone else, and we're adapting to a new world of working remotely, social distancing, while continuing to focus on raising funds for much needed cancer research. We've entitled this series, Cancer Doesn't Sleep and Neither Do We. Raising funds for cancer research and prevention remains our #1 priority. We have many colleagues in this battle, and I'm very pleased to have two of us join us today. Professor Michelle Haber is Executive Director of the Children's Cancer Institute. Professor Richard Locke is with Children's Cancer Institute and one of the lead researchers within that group. They, along with their colleagues at CCIA, are well known to Tour de Cure. We're very pleased to have them with us today. But we thought it would be useful for everyone on the Tour de Cure family to get a perspective from our research colleagues about how life has changed for them in the midst of these unprecedented times. And with that, I'd like to welcome Michelle and Richard to this series.
Thank you.
First of all, let me just throw the question open to you. How are you both going?
Surprisingly well under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Like most people in the world, I'm completely self-isolated. I happen to have a long-standing autoimmune disease, so I'm very self-isolated, and I've been within these four walls for the last 4 weeks since this started, but going very well because on a daily basis, I'm privileged to be running our institute by Zoom. I didn't know it was possible, but it is. And so we have meetings on a daily basis with our executive team, with our research team, with the researchers, with the research leaders, making sure that everyone is being as productive as they can possibly be in this time, and that people are doing well and feeling comfortable in these very strange circumstances. So I can't complain too much in a terribly difficult time. I'm doing okay, Paul. Thank you.
Terrific. Good to hear. How about you, Richard?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. Thank you, Paul. And as Michelle said, it takes a bit of getting used to and a bit of adjustment, but you know, one has to recognize that there are a lot of people in the world who are much worse off than we are. So I'm doing very well in comparison. Terrific
to hear. One of the things that we have been endeavoring to do with Tour de Cure over the last number of years is sort of bridge the gap, if you will, between the fundraising and the actual work that the research teams are doing that are out there, and to a certain extent to demystify what happens in the lab. So, you know, we would as a group have relatively vague concepts of lab work and benches and beakers and computer models and so on and so forth. But what's happening now with the sort of shutdown that we've all been forced to work under? So maybe can you take us through perhaps what's happening on a day-to-day basis and how it's changed by virtue of the shutdown?
Sure. So we would normally have the vast majority of our scientists actually working in the laboratories at the bench with all of those images that you have of scientists in white coats and masks and gloves, and actually working, doing experiments at the bench, working with cancer cells, with tissue from patients, with experimental models of cancer where we can test new drugs and treatments, or where we can look at the genetic structure of the cells and work out what it is that's going on. That's where our people mostly are, but we also have a significant proportion of our scientists who what we call our dry lab people. And they're people who sit in front of their computers, they're analyzing the data, they're understanding what the genetic changes mean, they're interpreting the data, and they're writing up and getting that data presented for publication or for discussion at scientific meetings. So what's happened since this COVID crisis hit us is that balance has changed dramatically. And instead of what would have probably been 80% wet lab and 20% dry lab, we've now reversed that completely. And we've got probably 90% of all of our staff at the Institute are working from home safely, but nevertheless productively, whereas at the, and I'll come back to what they're doing in a minute.
Yeah.
But we have got a core group of researchers who are in the lab on a daily basis, obviously socially distanced and very safe and protected within this environment, but working on what we call the absolutely critical, cannot stop aspects of our research. And they include aspects of research where we're doing patient diagnostics or testing, actually analysing patient samples, understanding what is driving individual children's cancers, and then returning that information to the clinicians in real time to determine treatment decisions by the clinicians who are treating those kids. So we have not stopped that at all. We have those teams in, that's both for our Zero Childhood Cancer, which is our precision medicine program. We also have a national leukemia diagnostic program called Minimal Residual Disease Testing. And in fact, that's one of the programs that Tour de Cure funded us for a number of years, and actually resulted in a doubling of the survival rates of children with high-risk leukemia from 35% to over 70% in the space of a decade. And that was research funded by Tour de Cure. And so that's now standard of care for all children in the country who are diagnosed with high risk, or who have high risk acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is the commonest childhood cancer. And those teams are in the lab. We are not stopping that. That's core to our mission, our vision. And so they're working there under challenging circumstances because they're not in their usual teams. We've had to split the teams into two so that we've got backups in case someone on one team got sick. But basically, those guys and girls are doing their job and making sure that those results get out there. We're also have teams who are finishing off critical experiments that are long-term experiments where there's been a very significant investment, time, energy, and funding. And if they were stopped just before the end, then that would have been a huge loss of both knowledge and all the funds that had gone into that. So those experiments are being completed. And so they're the teams that are in the labs at the moment, but our researchers who are at home are also being very productive. So there are several aspects to science. First, you have to do the experiments, and then you have to work out what the data means. So, and often it's hard to find the time to do that in-depth analysis, to review the literature, to make sure you truly understand it, to write up your results, to put them in a publication that will share those results with the world. And so that's what our teams who are at home are focusing on at the moment. And that's keeping them very busy because that's a huge part of science. Is actually getting that data out there. So many of our most productive postdoctoral researchers and our more junior researchers are contributing to that research effort currently of getting that data analysed, processed, produced, and submitted to the leading international journals to share our data with the world. So it's a bit of a shift, but we are making sure that the science, to the best of our ability under these difficult circumstances, is proceeding.
Thank you. Richard, what's happening in terms of your work?
So in terms of our work, we have some very important drug testing programs and collaborations that are going on an international scale. We have a long-standing relationship with the National Cancer Institute in the US, in which we test novel drugs to prioritize them for clinical trials for children with high-risk cancers. And that's a long-standing funding that we've had for 15 years. And it's critical that that research is continued. And we've had to make some adjustments because, as Michelle said, we've got to make sure that we have teams coming in on separate days. So we're continuing that vital research, but we've had to adjust teams so that they come in on alternate days. They don't socialize with each other, but in the same token that they communicate with each other to ensure that the work is done as required every day. So we're continuing to do that vital research to make our commitments to the National Cancer Institute.
And how does it impact on the collaboration, which is a necessary part of research? Are you seeing differences? Are you seeing teams are able to adjust? What are the things that are if you're to look at this as a scientist, what are you observing in this very changed environment in terms of the way that the work gets done?
Well, I guess one of the characteristics of being a scientist I've learned is that you have to be resilient and you have to be adaptable. And in my dealings with my national, and international collaborators, we're continuing to collaborate. We're continuing to plan future collaborations because the way that we do interact is predominantly through virtual means. And so when I have teleconferences with my colleagues in the US, it's via this same medium that we're doing right now. It's not necessarily recorded and then disseminated to other people, but we are now on video teleconference, and we're continuing to do so. So in that regard, very little has changed in what I do, because I'm still having those video conferences on an international scale, except that I'm now doing it from home as opposed to going into my office almost every day, which has been quite an adjustment.
I've heard quite a few people comment that they miss going into the office. So I can well imagine. How do you, when you're dealing with any of your international colleagues that are working in other countries, obviously around the world, we're seeing the impact of this pandemic is being rolled out at different stages with sadly very different impact depending where you are. I worked for many years with a group based in Milan. And I've had contact with some of my former colleagues there, and I have to say it's very sobering when you hear from people that have been in lockdown in apartments in northern Italy for the last 5, 6, 7 weeks, and hearing from them what the impact is like. What are you hearing from your international colleagues about how they're reacting and what their mood is in the midst of this crisis?
Well, if I could just continue on from the strong and long-standing collaboration I've had with the US, just last week we set up a special meeting with all the principal investigators. So the consortium that my lab is a member of has 4 other research programs, and they're all based in the US. And then there's a coordinating center which is also based in the US. So we're the only testing site that is based outside of the US, but we went around the table and all of the principal investigators described what their work environment had become and the adjustments that they had to make. And I kicked off first, and I just highlighted some of the changes that we'd made, and then we went to the other investigators. They were pretty much in the same situation as we are right now, that we were working in teams that were separated, but we were continuing the very important ongoing research. But then there was one of the research programs that their entire university campus was on lockdown, and people weren't allowed to go into the labs anymore. So they weren't even allowed to have any kind of a skeleton operation in their lab. So that was quite different. So for the most part, we were in a similar situation, and I have yet to talk to a significant number of colleagues in Europe to learn what they are going through. And I don't know whether Michelle has any insight on that.
Yeah, I have a number of European colleagues. One of them is at the University of Bologna, and he flagged quite early on, weeks ago, what was really a a devastating email describing what Italy was like at the time, what their research was like, how people were, dying in the intensive care wards because the medical system was completely swamped, how their research had been shut down. It was really a cry from the heart, and it made, I think, me realize that as we have come into this COVID epidemic, as Richard said, that there are many groups that are doing it tougher than us. Certainly my son is a young scientist at Harvard, and he is in that group that Richard referred to, where Harvard, the greatest academic institution in the world, arguably, has shut its doors, literally. They turned off the lights. Any of their animal models or mice that they were using for testing, anything that they were doing, all of that work has been completely stopped, and it's as if 2020 has not existed, and they will restart the clock in 2021. So I'm grateful, actually, that we are able to continue at least with a significant portion of our research, that we are keeping in touch with our scientists on a daily basis. Every group in the Institute is having a minimum of a weekly meeting with their research teams, and mostly several more than that. And I think the international research community has been extremely resilient, and there's even a greater degree of connectedness. Richard rightly points out that we are an island country here, and we are separated by distance. And as a result of that, we've got used to having these international teleconferences at bizarre hours of the morning and night to meet with and plan with our clinical and research colleagues. And indeed, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've had at least 3 teleconferences planning a European, US, UK, Australian international clinical trial of a new treatment that we've developed here in Australia. I've got another teleconference scheduled at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning with an international pharmaceutical company that wants to work with us with bringing new drugs and giving access to children with cancer. And even our scientific meetings, where we go and present our data, which are the actual lifeblood of how we get new ideas and interact with colleagues. The biggest meeting was due to be, the American Association for Cancer Research meeting was due to be in a couple of weeks' time. They have recreated that as a virtual meeting, one in April and one in June. So I was had been invited to give a talk on our National Child Cancer Precision Medicine program, where every child in the country with high-risk cancer has their tumor profiled so that we can give the best possible treatment to the best child, to the right child at the right time. I've been asked to give a talk on that at the presidential symposium at the AACR meeting, this American Association for Cancer Research meeting. That's been rescheduled as a virtual meeting in June. So I will still be able to share that information with the world. And so this is remarkable resilience, remarkable flexibility, and remarkable ability to adapt to this extraordinary environment, but to do so in a very cohesive and united approach of the scientific world to make sure that research doesn't stop, to the best of their ability.
One of the examples that when you read applications for cancer research, there's often reference to mouse models. I wonder if I might maybe just ask you to explain a bit more about what is a mouse model, and what's the relevance to that if you have a lab which has to go into hibernation, to use that term. Because it's a technical area and there's a lot to it, but there's some real implications if you can't continue with that type of work. Is that not correct?
Yeah, in fact, we are making sure that all of our models are being protected. That is one of the areas that we've regarded as essential research, because they are absolutely critical, these models, to our research and our ability to translate what we do in the laboratory into the clinic, because we need to either have models of particular forms of disease and to be able to test whether certain treatments work on those. And equally, we have avatar mice where we can actually grow the patient's tumor in individual mice and then test the response of each patient's tumor to the drugs that we would then go ahead and treat in the children. So these models are quite critical to our research, and therefore we have a core team of our people making sure that those models are protected, because they are absolutely key to our ability to deliver better, safer treatments for the children that we're focused on delivering cures for.
So broadly speaking, Paul, if I could just interject and explain to the audience that so broadly speaking, there are two mouse models of cancer. One is which you can actually take laboratory mouse strains and genetically engineer them to actually develop a cancer that has similar traits to human cancer. So these are then genetically engineered mouse models. So the mouse strain itself will express human genes that that drive the cancer, and so it's vital to maintain those strains of mice. The second main model is where you have laboratory strains of mice that lack an immune system, and again these mice won't live outside of a laboratory environment. But then you can take these mice and you can inoculate them with human cancer. So you take a patient-derived tumor, as Michelle has said, and some people call these mice avatars, but then you inject the human cancer cells into the mice, and they develop essentially a human cancer. And that's one of the main models that we use to test new drugs to prioritize them for clinical trials in kids with cancer. But both models are vital to our research, and we're absolutely protecting those models for the future.
Let me ask you both, if I can, because you're both very heavily involved with zero childhood cancer, which is obviously it's a program which anyone that understands it would have to say it's something that we need to see continue and to thrive and to generate insights from it. How do you continue to support that, which is a real interface, if you will, between the research which is happening at the bench and then the application to the individual child? How do you continue to support that in this environment?
So I guess it's a part of the same question. How do we continue to support all of our research in this environment? We are heavily reliant on the community, as you would well know, Paul, with Tour de Cure being one of our stalwart supporters in this area. The research that we're able to undertake and the cures that we're able to deliver and the new treatments that we're able to develop are a partnership between the skills and capabilities of our scientists and the doctors in partnership with the community and with government. And both of those sources are absolutely critical. Government, other funding agencies who we apply to, as we apply to Tour de Cure, to have our scientific ideas assessed for their quality and their likely ability to deliver great outcomes for kids with cancer. In this environment, fundraising is very challenging. That we are reliant on many sources of fundraising, but a very major one is events, whether it's bike rides, whether it's swimming events like the Balmoral Swim, whether it's balls, like your snowball or our diamond ball. These raise millions of dollars for us. And in a heartbeat, these have evaporated in the last 3 weeks as any event. Well, events don't exist anymore, frankly. Yeah. So the impact can be measured in terms of millions of dollars worth of lost funding. So that's very challenging for us at the Institute, and we've had to very significantly tighten our belts at the Institute, both in terms of cutting all discretionary funding, but also looking to how we can manage the salary bills of our staff as well, making sure that we retain all of our scientists, but we do so in a way that is fiscally responsible to ensure that the Institute is strong and resilient and will come out of this ready to take off at the same trajectory as it was. So it is extremely challenging. Zero childhood cancer is our flagship program in terms of how our research impacts on a day-to-day basis of the lives of children with cancer, how the results of testing each child's cancer will then be used to determine their treatment by their doctors, ensuring that we can continue to have support from that, from our community, from our funders, and also, talking to government about how they will hopefully be able to support this program into the longer term as well. These are critical issues for us at the Institute, because these are life-saving programs that can change the course of individuals and families, children's lives. There is no question of that.
Let me ask you the question, and it's not on the list, so I'm going to go slightly off piste here, Michelle, but you've opened the door, so let me walk through it. There's literally billions of dollars which have been earmarked by the Commonwealth government to provide stimulus packages, all with the right intentions to keep people, wherever possible, in jobs, and to effectively assist businesses go into, if you will, a state of hibernation, but that hopefully that they can kick out of it and the jobs can then obviously come back online. Is there anything specific that's being done to support research institutions? Because you have the same commercial challenges as any other people-intensive organization. You've got labor costs, which at the end of the day, they don't go away. And at the end of the day, if you're getting challenged on the fundraising side of things, which is your revenue, how do you respond? And are you seeing anything from the Commonwealth or the state governments to assist here?
So there hasn't been anything in the way of a specific support package for medical research institutes, but we are charitable organisations,
okay.
And therefore we are hopeful. And in fact, just had an executive meeting this morning where we were looking at our eligibility. We are hopeful that we may be able to qualify for the JobKeeper package, but we are literally working our way through that. The ATO rules only came out, as you would know, on just the night of Easter. So we're looking at that. And if we are eligible for that, then that will certainly, we hope, help us bridge some of our gap. It will not be the whole gap by any means, but we are hopeful that it will help. And we were grateful when the government actually reduced the requirements for charities from rather than a 30% drop in income to a 15%, and that we are very hopeful will help us. But we felt and still feel very strongly that we have needed to take our own cost-cutting measures to ensure that we would be able to both protect jobs and be fiscally responsible, so that we could protect the long-term capabilities of the Institute to deliver on its mission and vision, and that is absolutely critical to us.
Some of the early research that I've seen in terms of the general feeling within the Australian community about the impact of the virus and how different cohort groups are responding would indicate that it's the young people in their 20s, let's say, who are actually most stressed by this. It's unprecedented for everyone, but for someone who is just starting off in their career and so on, to have all this uncertainty thrust upon them is actually that much more, if you will, alarming. How do the young researchers within your teams, how do they respond to that? Maybe, Richard, I can turn that one to you and get you to respond to that question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's obviously a challenge for these young individuals. We have teams of bright young researchers who their first love is to get into the lab and do experiments, as I did 30 years ago, and that's how you start out in science. And they love to come in and they love to go into the lab and they love to discover things and be collaborating with their colleagues. And obviously, when they are then asked to be socially responsible and only come into the lab when absolutely necessary and don't go out, it's a challenge for them, as it is with any young person. And I'm having twice weekly conferences with my group to try and still instill that group mentality and collaboration, and individual meetings with them all by video, to ensure that they're still having a balanced life in as much as they can, to not be working the whole time and take regular breaks. But a lot of young people are facing this challenge, and but quite frankly, I've been inspired by the responses I've seen in the young researchers in the Institute to this crisis.
Do you see any impacts over the long term to the shape of research, which has been on a particular path up until this point in time? We hit what is clearly a break in rhythm. Do you think it has a longer term impact on either the outcomes or the shape of research coming out of this crisis?
I think it will depend how long this goes on for. If
Sure.
this was, if we could see the end of this in 3 months or even 6 months, I think that 6 months will be getting very hard, I could say.
Right.
But I think if it's 3 months, we will be okay. And if we're able to protect our assets, which are our people and our critical model systems, then I don't see it having a longer term impact. The longer this goes on, the more the likelihood of really significantly delaying new discoveries, because while our people are at home and they're writing up their existing data and they're analyzing that, that's great. But there will be a point at which that will be done, and then they will be wanting to start generating new data. And if they're not able to go back into the labs and do that, then that will cause a hiatus, a period of loss that we won't get back, and we'll just have to redouble our efforts when we do get back into the lab to make up for lost time. But I think that if we see our way out of this before, in the foreseeable future, and obviously our numbers are looking good in Australia at the moment, and please may that continue and continue to improve, then hopefully I'm very much a glass half full person, and I'm hopeful that that we will be able to get our scientists into the labs before too long, before any critical damage is done to our overall research effort.
Richard, any thoughts on that?
I agree wholeheartedly with Michelle, and I think once we come out of this, we will reassess. There's obviously impact on our higher degree students, because when a young person enrolls in a PhD nowadays, they are on a strict timeline set by the university to graduate in a certain number of years, and I think a lot of those young people are feeling stress as to, well, I'm just losing time now on my enrollment. And some of them, when they come from overseas and they're on scholarships, they can't just go on program leave because their scholarship will cease at that point. So, they need to keep their scholarship to be able to live. And so there's anxiety there as to whether they are going to be able to make sufficient progress on their higher degrees. But it's going to be interesting to see when we come out of this how the research environment may change in terms of emphasis of government on preventing these sort of these crises re-happening in the future. So that's another area that we're going to have to deal with as well.
I think everyone's been shocked how quickly it can all unfold.
Yeah.
It's staggering to think what's happened in the space of 4 to 6 weeks around the world, from something that was obviously an issue, but it was isolated and wasn't something that was going to impact on me. Today, everyone's feeling it. So yeah. You're right. It will attract attention. There's no question about that. Look, clearly, within Tour de Cure, we've had to make adjustments with our team in Central. We have a small group there, and everyone has absolutely, put their head down to try and work through that as best they can. We like you are concerned about how do we make sure that all of the intellectual property, if you will, that we've developed through this very talented team about how you run these events and how you engage people. We don't want to lose that at all. And there's real commitment. If anything, there's ferocious commitment to making sure that does not get lost in this process. And likewise, you're doing everything that you can within your research teams and the broader institute. The other group that's obviously completely relevant here, and which is impacted by this, are families with children who have been diagnosed with cancer. And we were talking about this as a group, and I made the observation, COVID-19 looks like a crisis until you actually are coming out of a doctor's office with a diagnosis that your child is ill, and then everything else pales into insignificance. How, to the extent that you have a view on that, how are families dealing with it in this new environment? How's that family that's already so challenged dealing with these new constraints?
So I've spoken to a number of our clinical colleagues about this who are on the coalface treating the kids with cancer, or even with the ones where the children have successfully gone through their treatment and are now in longer term follow-up clinics. And the parents are universally very stressed by this. Parents whose kids who have been off treatment and doing well are ringing and saying, are their children more susceptible? Are they at greater risk? Do they need to protect them? Is this, they live with the ever-present fear of relapse, but now suddenly there's a new fear. Are they likely to get sick and be taken away from them in a new way? And for the parents on the ward, a very high degree of anxiety about what this means if this were to come into the hospital, if it, I think that this is for parents of kids with cancer, it's a devastating time when their children are diagnosed. The journey is one that anyone who's spoken to parents of kids with cancer is emotive and fraught with stress and pain and anxiety. And this is just another level of distress on top of that. So it's certainly not making life any easier for these families, that's for sure. It's a terrible journey at the best of times, and this isn't helping.
Well, look, from our point of view, we are looking at this as a point within Tour de Cure where we don't stop, we simply pause. And, to a large extent, much as you have reframed the priorities within the various research programs you have, we're doing things within Tour de Cure that we've been talking about doing for years, but haven't had the clear runway to get them done. So we have a chance to do those sort of things now, which we feel it should help us to come out of this stronger than ever. But it's very much a question of pausing and not stopping in our work. And we are completely motivated to make up whatever lost time that we have so that we can continue to support the very important work that you and your teams are doing, and in other research institutes around Australia. And to the extent that you've been able to share with us today some of your observations and how you're living with it, it helps the people within the Tour de Cure family who are keen as anything to get back out on the road, to raise the funds, to run the events, etc., so that we can continue on this journey together. So look, let me leave it at that. Please extend my warm thanks to all of your colleagues at the Institute. We're very much supportive of everything that you have underway. I appreciate the time both of you have given to us this morning, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Paul, and please extend my personal thanks to the whole Tour de Cure family. We are very appreciative of the funding that they give to my program and my team members and all of the Institute. It really is a wonderful thing that you do for us.
Paul, yes, I'll just add to that. As you know, I've been joined along on a couple of the events with my husband, riding on them. I see what you do. I know what you do. I know many of the Tour de Cure team. You are wonderful. And even for you to put the time together to do this and to involve us so that we can share our stories with your broader community, with our collective cancer research community, I think it's fantastic. And so a huge thank you to you for everything that you do, and to all of your folks. Get back on the bikes when you can, and it will be wonderful for us all to be together doing what we all want to do, which is to cure kids and men and women with cancer. That is the most important thing for us all. Thank you, Paul.
Pass it on. We look forward to doing so. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.